What's up, everyone? Matt Vogt here. Welcome back to the Lifestyle Practice Podcast. You know what we're all about here at TLP. My partners, Derek, Steve, and I, we want you all to achieve amazing things in your dental career and in your life. And most of the time, if you're a dentist, that involves owning a kick-ass dental practice. And we want you to have one of those. We want to help you achieve amazing things in your dental practice. So go visit us at thelifestylepractice.com to learn more about what we're all about, learn how to work with us. Subscribe to this podcast, send it to a friend, get involved. We want this message that we get out to you each week on the podcast to reach as many people, as many dentists as possible who need our help and who want to grow along with us and our entire audience. So let's just jump right back into it. If you've been following along on my podcast here every few weeks, we've talked about a lot of practical, real world stuff the last few episodes. We talked about how to determine how many assistants to have in your office, how to determine how many front office team members, how to determine how many hygienists you should have. And so today's a bit of a bonus episode along those lines, talking about staffing in our practice. And the title of today's episode is, when should you add an associate dentist in your practice? Now, to talk about that one question alone, I think this podcast could be hours long. But to answer that, I think you've got to ask yourself one very simple question. And that question is, what do I want? And here's what I mean by that. Adding an associate dentist, another dentist in your practice, is not just the next logical step to growth. It's not, okay, we hit this production number last year, or we did XYZ. What do we do next to grow? We add an associate. That's not how it works, in my opinion. It comes down to what you want. And so I think to answer this question, you've got to look really deep inside. You've got to take some time to think about what your goals are, not just now in this very moment, but for your entire life, for your entire career in dentistry. What do you want? Do you want to be the lone wolf? Do you want to work by yourself? Do you want simplicity? Do you want minimal moving parts and pieces? Do you want to work with more people? Do you enjoy mentoring? Do you enjoy working side by side with a colleague? I know people who, want to, or dentists who want to go to study clubs and want to go to conferences and travel and take CE and enjoy the social aspect of things. And that's awesome. And I know other dentists who are, as I said, kind of lone wolves. They're great dentists. They love what they do, but they don't enjoy that kind of social camaraderie aspect of being a dentist. And so that can play into this question too. What do you want? If you really, really think about that question as a practice owner, I think it'll help you answer the original question, which is, should I add an associate in my dental practice? If you all are longtime listeners of the podcast, you kind of know our different journeys, Derek, Steve, and I in dentistry. Derek and Steve practice by themselves for, the entire lives of their practices. I've been working with an associate in my practice now for over a couple years. So no path is right or wrong, but there are certainly pros and cons. But again, I think it comes down to what you want. Derek and Steve, they absolutely excelled as the lone wolves in their practices. And I know that they're awesome leaders too. So they were basically able to do it all in their practices. And I have an immense respect for that. When it came to my decision to add an associate in my practice, there were other things that I wanted to accomplish in practice. I very much enjoy being a dentist, but it is not the end all be all for me. It is not something that I quite truthfully wake up thinking about in the morning and saying, oh gosh, I can't wait to do this today. It's a pursuit. It's something that's very honorable and I have an immense amount of respect for, but it's not something that's like a true calling for me. And that's okay. That's totally fine. I'm sure a lot of you all can relate to that. And I'm not saying that you have to, dentistry has to be your absolute calling to practice solo. But for me, I have passions and pursuits outside of dentistry. This podcast and what we do at TLP being a huge part of that, and other things as well. So I knew that my practice still had room to grow. I had 8 operatories available in my practice. And if you're listening or watching the video podcast, you can see the name of our practice. It was always the dentists. That was always a part of the plan because of the size of the practice. And I do enjoy the camaraderie aspect of working with someone else. It's comes with its own challenges and things, as we'll get into, but I really do enjoy that. And so I just always had that vision in my mind that that's how it would be. And once it came time to start to explore this, that was the fork in the road that I chose. And I have a feeling a lot of you all are approaching that fork, or or you may be planning way ahead to try to think and learn as much as you can about ownership. And so let's talk a little bit more about that this topic today, and help get you some insight and clarity into this very common question about adding an associate in your practice. So a lot of the time, this discussion, it immediately brings up metrics and numbers, and you have to have a practice of this size or that's produced this much to have to be able to add an associate dentist. And sure, there are some things that we want to we want to have a successful practice before we consider doing this, but I think there's some more philosophical topics to discuss when it comes to adding an associate dentist in your practice. First, what is just the overall current state of your practice? And I think that can be boiled down to two pretty simple things. Are you producing a substantial amount? Are you producing enough to where, in theory, two dentists, at least each one working part time, could this practice support two people? You just have to be realistic about that. I don't think there's an exact number. I think seven figures or more is kind of a basic benchmark for that. Obviously, the more is better. Another very basic thing to look at when we're talking about the current state of your practice is, do you have a low overhead practice? Are you running an efficient shop? Because the last thing we want, if we have high overhead, or we're stressed about our expenses, or if we're in growth mode and we're not maximizing our achieving what we can with our productivity in our practice just yet, the last thing we want to do is add another expense or take potential profit off of our plate and give it to another dentist. That is just a recipe for compounding stress in your lives, and I wouldn't wish that upon anybody. So, are you running an efficient shop? I think it's very important to have that box checked before you even consider this question of adding an associate. Second, I think you just need to think about, do you really want to focus on being a clinician or also make a living by running a business? And think about, what are you really, really good at? So I could see there being a number of different reasons to add or not add an associate. Some dentists will think, well, when I add an associate, I'm going to get to do all the procedures that I want to do, and this other dentist is going to get the scraps. So they're going to only, do the things I don't want to do. And if you're thinking that in the back of your head, I would say never ever add an associate, because that is such a selfish way of thinking about this. When you're thinking about adding a clinician, a peer, to your team, you really should be thinking about, how do I help this person create what they want, an awesome career out of working at my practice. That should be kind of your first thing that you think about when bringing on another dentist. Now, over time, like, let's say you find a dentist, potential associate, that has complementary interests to you. I've used this example about my practice all the time. My associate doesn't particularly enjoy surgery. She pushes herself to do more and more, which is awesome. But she doesn't place implants, and I love doing that. It's something I'm extremely passionate about. I would do it all day long and only do that if I could. So we have a nice yin and yang. We kind of internally refer to each other within the practice, and we don't cannibalize each other with the treatment that we're doing in the practice. That wasn't me going to her and saying, "Hey, I only want to do these surgical procedures. I want to be the only one doing implants. So any implant that comes by, you've got to give that to me, and you can do everything else." Not the case at all. So when we're talking about this question, do you want to focus on being a clinician or also make a living by running a business? If you're bringing on an associate, you have to acknowledge that a big part of your job, a bigger part than if you were just practicing solo, is going to be running and managing a dental practice, a business. Uh, there's going to be more communication that's needed, more leadership on your part, more guidance, more vision for the entire practice, no matter what the situation. So if you don't feel comfortable with taking that on, if you don't feel like you're really good at that, you've got to get good at it, or potentially just stick to solo practice, and you can do amazing things and make an amazing living owning a solo dental practice. But I've seen it happen a lot, and it's not necessarily with clients of my own, but it's most of the time it's their bosses or their practice owners when they're still associates and we're working together to get into practice ownership and then grow that practice. It's their bosses where they're very absentee. They almost don't even acknowledge the associate and their wants, their needs, their desires. There's no future there. There's no growth. There's no collaboration. It's just, I hired you thinking that you would make me money or you would let me take more days off. It's just not the way to do it. And I know that because I talk to so many people who are trying to get out of situations like that, who are trying to get out on their own. The associates that I talk to that are happy and excelling in their practices, and if you're an associate, you fall into this category, they're working in a practice potentially with another doctor who really is just invested in their success and cares about their success. They're not selfish about the things that they want in their practice. They know that by ensuring the success of their associate and also the rest of their employees, the rest of their team, they're ultimately going to succeed more than if they had been selfish in that scenario. It's the leaders eat last example. If you're thinking about adding an associate, you really got to think if you're comfortable with that whole scenario that I just described. It's really, really important. And it's more important than like the state of your practice or the numbers of what's going on. Third, along those lines, are you a great communicator? I think it is so important if you're increasing the size of your team and adding a dentist who you are going to share patients with, review cases with, you are going to collaborate with. Even if you're not working at the same time and you're like splitting a shift, you have to work together. Can you communicate? And then can you communicate with your team on how we're going to grow our practice from one dentist to two? Can you communicate with patients and build trust with your patients in this new doctor? They're not going to just be able to do it themselves. And a lot of your patients are going to want to see you for everything. They're not even going to want to come near that associate dentist. Well, how do you communicate with them to build up their trust in that new doctor? You can't just continue to see all of your patients. I'm doing air quotes on the video podcast here. They're not just your patients. They're your practice's patients. And if you're adding an associate, you've got to get comfortable with that. Are you going to be able to communicate with your new associate and guide them in this new position? This is a person who is a peer. It's a fellow DDS or DMD. It's also an employee, right? You're also their boss. How are you going to communicate with them to make them a great part of your practice while also fulfilling their goals and their wants and desires? It's difficult. I mean, this is the most difficult part of growing from a solo practice to an associate driven practice. It's absolutely the most difficult part. Unless you are just a master business person, organizer and systemizer of a dental practice or multiple dental practices, I think you just have to be an exceptional communicator to successfully add a associate dentist in your practice. If you're the type of person who, doesn't want to talk with the team, is, I'm not going to say quiet, but is almost afraid to have crucial or critical conversations when you're in your practice and you're kind of avoiding conflict and avoiding those any tough moments, I would reflect really hard on that before bringing on another dentist into the equation. And so the fourth and final kind of thought I have at the moment on this topic is, how easy is it to find an associate dentist to hire in your area? And what happens if they need to leave at some point? What happens if they move? What happens if it doesn't work out between the two of you? Derek has talked about this on the podcast, talking about some of the difficulties about having an associate. And if you are in an area where, let's say it's more rural, let's say it's more difficult to just find a dentist or multiple dentists when you put up a job posting, it might be just more difficult in general to run an associate driven practice. It's not impossible, but compared to living in a major metro area or in an area nearby a dental school, which is where a lot of dentists tend to congregate, probably be more difficult. Something you've got to think about is, if you're bringing on an associate dentist, you're committing to expanding your practice. Let's use my office as an example. I loved the TLP schedule and the TLP model that we had going, working 3 days a week. I knew if I was going to add an associate, we had to grow that schedule, and we grew to 4 days a week with multiple doctors on several days of the week. So when that schedule grows and your hours for your team grow and just the expectation from your patients on when you're going to be there, it's kind of difficult to put that toothpaste back in the tube. If you hire an associate, let's say you're in rural, wherever, you hire an associate, you grow your practice, you expand your hours, you make all of these kind of investments and changes, and then that person leaves and you can't find someone to fill their shoes very easily. Well, you've either got to do that yourself and fill those shoes yourself, or you've got to then go back on all that work and all the things you did to grow and expand your practice, and that's pretty difficult to do. And it's also difficult to try to operate a practice that's meant for two dentists all on your own. So that's a very real risk, and it's something that needs to be thought about before you just willy-nilly say, yeah, let's add an associate. That's the next logical step. Well, are you prepared to potentially deal with this complication of the associate driven practice or the multiple dentist practice? For me, early on, when I was thinking about, what I was at this fork in the road, as I described, I said, you know what, I'm in Indianapolis. I'm 15 minutes from the dental school, IU dental school. I think there's a lot of opportunity to find potential candidates for my practice. And fortunately, I was correct in that way. I have never owned a practice in rural America or further away from a dental school, but I know a practice like maybe Derek's, for instance, when he owned it in Texas, a little bit out in the boonies. I know that would be more difficult. Derek could probably attract a ton of dentists to that practice if he still owned it, just because of how awesome it was. But yeah, it would definitely be more difficult. You just have less people willing to make that drive. So you got to think about the demographics of your practice and these potential scenarios if you're thinking about this question. So that's the best single podcast size summary I could give to answer that question that we titled this episode. Should you add an associate? It's funny when I get on a roll with some of these podcasts, I've got my notes here in front of me and some bullet points, but I just start going crazy. I look at the time on the timer here on the recording, and I just want to keep going and keep going and keep going. But that's just, I don't know, the excitement I have for topics like this sometimes. But I want to hear from you all. This is a really interesting topic because it's not perfectly black and white. So email me, matt@thelifestylepractice.com. Do you have an associate? Are you looking to add an associate? If you do, is it going well? Has it not gone well? I just want to hear, from you all, because I always love having some discussions and getting some experiences from listeners on topics like this. You can also pop into the private Facebook group we have, TLP Podcast for Dentists. Just search for that on Facebook, or I think you can click on the link in the show notes to request to join. And let's have a little bit of a discussion on this, because I think it's a great topic when thinking about practice growth. Like I mentioned, email me if you need anything, matt@thelifestylepractice.com. Until next time on the podcast, I wish you the absolute best and a great start to 2025. I hope you're just kicking ass so far in this first few weeks of the year, and we'll talk to you again soon towards the end of the month. Cheers, everybody. Take care. Sicker than your average, sicker than your average. Sicker than your average, sicker than your average.